Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Connect with your potential customers wherever they are. Effective uses Comcast viewership data insights to combine advanced targeting capabilities with premium TV and streaming content, so you can deliver the best ad experiences to your audience no matter how they watch. Visit EFFECTV.com.
We are going to appoint Mad Dog Mattis as our Secretary of Defense. Mad Dog. He's great. He is great. I asked one of the generals, I love the generals, and I won't use his name, but he probably would come forward. But I said to him, "You're a good general." "Yes, sir, I am." I said, "So how do you compare to General Mattis? How do you compare to Mad Dog?" "Sir, he's better than I am." I loved it. I said, "I love you to say that." They love him.
Hello world, you're listening to Strategicon, your window to all things security and foreign affairs. It is Friday, December 9, 2016, episode 20. For today's topic, we'll be joined by Strategicon co-host and SIA's resident existentialist philosopher David Olney. Hello David.
Greetings John, greetings listeners.
Before we get started on today's episode, I would like to remind listeners that Strategicon can be found on iTunes, SoundCloud, YouTube, as well as a link to our podcast on the Sage International Australia website, www.sageinternational.org.au. Today's episode, we'll be looking at the thorny issue of military leadership in the modern age. Following on from the announcement that retired US Marine Corps General James Mad Dog Mattis is soon to be President Trump's Secretary of Defense, a man known for his questioning of America's civilian leadership, a reputation that got him fired from his post as head of US Central Command under Obama in 2013. Was this a wise choice? Allegedly, Mattis was in favor of strong actions against Iran, a country whose hands has been behind supporting anti-American groups in Afghanistan and Iraq. In a piece written by former founder and CEO of American think tank Stratfor, and who now heads up Geopolitical Futures, George Friedman reflected on the idea that it is no crime for a military man to confront the policy options of civilian or military bureaucrats. In his views, such bureaucrats are usually far removed from any combat zone, generally have no real-world experience serving in combat, and thus their grip on reality when it comes to launching and maintaining a war is flimsy at best. In Friedman's view, and I quote, "The President is Commander-in-Chief, and the Secretary of Defense is whom senior leaders must report to. The senior commanders are far from the battlefield as civilians, and their knowledge of the battlefield is what they read in reports from the field. Some have heard a shot fired and angered at some point. Many have never been in combat. They are part of the same system of denial as are the civilians. But a career's worth of effort has gone into your stars. You don't throw that away to tell the truth you may not know, and for which your career will be ended. It was true when Douglas MacArthur told Harry Truman he couldn't win in Korea without using nukes. It was not what Truman wanted to hear, nor did he want the public to hear it. So he fired MacArthur, accepted a draw, and portrayed MacArthur as a madman." End quote. So this idea of speaking truth to power, is it a unique burden that the military as an institution has to face? How has the civilian-military relationship in a Western bureaucratic cultural sense fared since World War II? Are those who practice the profession of arms forever doomed to kowtow to bureaucrats who have limited real-world experience in fighting? David?
Let's go back to the 1950s to the first really important book on this. we start with Samuel P. Huntington's PhD thesis, The Soldier and the State, where he argues in the 1950s that the political elite and the military elite are now both becoming professional classes without any shared experience. So this begins an unequal dialogue where the politicians are always interested in being politicians, have no experience beyond that, and professional soldiers have experience of soldiering, but don't have anything in common with their political leaders anymore. And that as a consequence of this, neither side really understands each other, and there is a massive risk for a huge loss of respect. And the underlying implication, it seems, in Huntington's book is it is beholden on the political elite that they ask for soldiers' opinions in private so that they can be well informed, and it's up to the military elite to provide unvarnished answers when they're asked. I think what we're seeing now, and the huge problem today, is the political elite think they're all-knowing. They're not providing that private, clear opportunity for generals to speak, which means the generals who genuinely believe I have a greater understanding of what's going on than my political master are left with no choice but to speak publicly. So what they're being punished for is truth in public.
Yep.
Because they're not being given the opportunity for truth in private.
So generally speaking, the idea of civilian leadership over the military, which was essentially established to prevent an unaccountable military from running a war without restraint, this was a noble aim, but now we have an unaccountable civilian leadership that are running wars that have been far from successful, and we only have to look at Iraq and Afghanistan as examples of that. I mean, can people in the defense military bureaucracy get the balance right between the technocratic leadership aspirations of civilian policy wonks and hard-bitten warriors, or are we condemned to have this non-creative tension remain with us for the duration?
I think the tension is innate to the system. The idea that what you have is an unequal professional dialogue. You have political masters who don't understand the soldiering, and you have soldiers who don't have to take the final decision. I think one of the great mistakes in this, though, is that the political elite seem to assume that if they didn't exercise civilian control, the military would go into crazy, ridiculous wars. Whereas what we see in the last 40 years, it's soldiers that understand the cost of war.
And act with restraint.
Precisely.
Yeah.
It's soldiers that go, is that really worth all my people's lives?
Yep.
Is that worth all this sort of political capital? Is this worth all this social capital? Is this worth the economic cost? So the irony is the relationship was set up to stop the military elite going too far, and yet it's the military elite who, because of their genuine understanding of the cost of war, seem to be the ones who are more likely to stop. We don't seem to now have the crazies like LeMay in the 50s and early 60s going, bomb them all with nukes. Now we have generals who go, hang on, this is what it's going to cost. So it seems we've had a complete inversion where the ethics of war and the cost of war is better understood by the people who actually would fight it if ordered, but that's part of the unequal dialogue. If ordered, they will do exactly what they're ordered to do, but you better listen to them the rest of the time and give them an opportunity to speak.
Is there not also another very overt problem with the way that we are managing military-civilian relations these days, and that is that the militaries in the West have become so highly professionalized that they are essentially Praetorian guards to their political masters, as opposed to being what they were in the old days when we had the draft and people were, assumed to do their service, do their time in the forces, and so therefore there was a more democratic compulsion in terms of their citizenship credentials and how the society viewed their military establishments. Do we not just have a problem on that score alone? Because if the military is devoid of being able to feed back into public legitimacy, then they do become the plaything of the politician.
And this is something that, again, we go back to Huntington's warning. What he was warning in the 50s is that both groups were coming professional.
Yeah.
So before that, with World War II, it didn't matter who got drafted and what they did, whether they went on to become a professional soldier at the end of World War II, or went back and became a professional politician, they had the common ground of having served as citizen soldiers. So really, the real nub of this is always, where is the common ground of experience between professionals who haven't had any common ground really since they were 18? At 18, the politician goes to university and gets involved in student politics. At 18, the young officer starts at a military academy to get their university degree.
Yep.
And from that point onwards, the common ground of society, it's something they're grounded in. They will partner up with someone in society. They will raise children in society. But from ever and onwards from that point, we have two professional worlds. So I think it's very easy to point the finger at professional soldiers and say, you're the problem, you're otherworldly. But as we can see in the US election, the otherworldliness of the Democrats and the Republicans meant Trump is now president.
Yep.
Here in Australia, we're seeing the otherworldliness of both the Liberals and the Labor Party lead to people like Pauline Hanson and her party growing, and alternative centrists like Nick Xenophon having an opportunity to go from being one senator to being three. So what we're seeing is this is never just a one-sided problem, but it's very easy for the political masters in their ignorance and stupidity, because they don't have enough experience, to say it's the soldiers' fault.
Yep.
When in reality, they are as morphed out of shape by professionalism. So really, Huntington's warning about professionals has to be taken more broadly. Would you trust anyone at 18 to not be morphed by a lifetime of training for one profession? So the ability for all of these people to speak truth in the appropriate environment, but knowing who makes a final decision, who gives a final order, who must follow a final order. As long as all that is clear, we're probably okay. What seems to be the growing problem now is that is becoming, gradually, or perhaps even quickly, more unclear.
One question that I have to ask you, in the Australian context, and I'm sure that it also happens elsewhere as well, especially in other Anglophone countries, but we're starting to see more control exercised by civilians in the defence and security area over the military. And by that I mean, you look at any major military base today, there is no mess life anymore. It's all been outsourced. There is no care taken specifically toward the soldier, the person in uniform. As a matter of fact, I could go one step further and suggest that those in the civilian echelons do think that they belong to a shadow force of some description, whereby they have their status, their bureaucratic status is given equal weight to military ranking, and in some cases you will have civilians who have this particular ranking structure bark orders at uniformed people because they can. This bespeaks to me a level of dysfunction in our force. There should be balance between the civilians and the military. There is no balance today. Has the pendulum swung too far in one direction?
Well, here we get to the outsourcing model, that really the civilians initially in this destabilised situation tended to be ex-uniform, coming back to do a similar job to what they'd done in uniform, but without having to deploy.
Yep.
So they walked in with the credibility of having once been in uniform. So that is a point to start with. It was part of the whole thing of, let's make this more efficient, let's save money. Now, when it was people who all understood the rules and had once been in uniform, maybe that could work. But when you've now got the combination of, let's get people once they're out of uniform and put them in as contractors, and now let's have contractors for the non-dangerous stuff, for civilians who have no real sense of what they've engaged in. Essentially, you have the kind of destabilisation there that we see throughout society, where economic rationalism has destabilised functional systems and cohesive cultures.
Yep.
So if it's wrecked industry, well, it's also a great danger for defence. To go back to an Australian example, it's a bit different. When you were talking, I immediately thought of General Cantwell here when he wrote his book after he'd been treated for post-traumatic stress.
Yeah, I remember that.
And he came out on the morning that a unit he'd commanded in Afghanistan was about to redeploy, and on national radio said, "There's no point to this war." So, listeners, I don't want anyone to assume that what we're saying here is everyone in uniform gets it right and everyone out of uniform is not understanding the issue. General Cantwell that day said to 1,500 Australians that there's no point in being in Afghanistan. You're about to deploy and it's pointless.
Yeah.
And as their former commander in country, there could not have been a more catastrophic thing he could have said. Now, he didn't say it again. Who knows who the phone call came from that said, look, have that thought. But the people you served with, who served under you, are about to go back. So the situation has got so fluid and so complex, the likelihood there will be mistakes on both sides. But the key thing is, it is the political side of this unequal dialogue that has the power to make space for honest dialogue and to make space for private honest dialogue. So they are the ones we have to hold to account.
Okay, so if it is clear that the political leadership is pursuing a course of action that leads their country to war, does a senior military commander have the right to question civilian authority, even if it comes from the highest office in the land?
Again, I'm going to play the lawyer card here and say, question's the wrong word. Can they explain to their political master that if we go forth with your proposition, here is the cost in blood, treasure and credibility? Questioning is one thing. Stating the consequences of a course of action, same outcome, different way of getting there.
Yeah, but obviously there's, in everything, there seems to be that taint of politics that follows one through. So even if one were to be honest with your civilian authority that, hey, listen, this particular course of action can be done in theory and in practice, but ultimately what the end result may not necessarily be in our national interest. That will have a massive impact on the civilian hearing it, and that massive impact will not necessarily be a rational one. It may be the desire to lash out at the person, just shoot the messenger kind of syndrome. Someone's just come to me and said that my plan, my perfect plan, the plan that I've been hatching for the last 6 months, 8 months or whatever, is now flawed. Well, I will not stand by this. I will go ahead and do whatever the hell I want, and irrespective of what, devil be damned, whatever the consequences are. This is not necessarily good for anyone, for any country and any sort of military kind of relationship with civilian political leadership. It tends to, again, speak of something that is a very difficult balance in terms to get rational outcomes. There were plenty of people, both in uniform and out of uniform, that thought that George W. Bush mishandled the Iraq situation. But at the time, when you're kind of caught up in the structure that your government wants to go to war, for whatever the reasons are, you do what you're told. After all, your civilian leadership are your paymasters. You do follow orders, essentially, no matter how flawed those orders are, because if you really, have a sense for survival in that kind of environment, you need to follow those orders. The chain of command itself, though, can be highly corrupted from a philosophical and a moral standpoint if you play those cards too heavily.
Well, again, if we go back to the fact it's the profession of arms, which means at some point you have to go and do the job.
Yeah.
So let's take a recent example of President Obama's first term and General David Petraeus running rings around Obama and his media team.
Yeah.
That David Petraeus could get his message out about Afghanistan more effectively with an interview first on Sunday morning in Washington, beating the president to the policy. So what we have in this environment of the profession of arms being so sophisticated is not just people who think in terms of the tactical. In order to do their jobs properly, they have to be educated at a level where they can conceive of the strategic. And as Stan McChrystal famously said, after resigning over the Rolling Stone article, I had to wise up about politics fast, and I didn't wise up quite fast enough. Well, you can see the opposite in David Petraeus.
Yep.
David Petraeus worked out that there's this game for making messages powerful in Washington, and he was better at it than the president. So this is the thing. By the very nature of you are still a citizen when you're a soldier, you have given up equality for a while. But even if you're a superstar, like Petraeus was, or like Stan McChrystal, or Mattis, or Flynn, your career is still over by mid-50s. You've achieved everything you're going to achieve in the military.
Yeah.
And you're mid-50s and probably fit, healthy, charismatic and disciplined. Perfect time to start your political career.
But you don't want to declare that in advance because
No.
otherwise you'll end up making all these enemies.
So the real problem is not that you can't have a second life,
Yeah.
but accepting that the unequal dialogue must last until the day where you are genuinely out of uniform.
Okay, well that leads me to the next question, and that is, should a military commander be punished for insubordination for expressing a view that doesn't sit well with his or her colleagues?
If that view was provided in that private, honest space, that would be totally unreasonable. If, like Petraeus, you use your media team to get on TV before the US president on a Sunday morning,
Yeah.
probably yes.
Yeah.
So if we look at someone like Mattis speaking honestly, we'll never know this far away whether Mattis thought he'd been asked a question that he was expected to answer honestly. He didn't compromise national security. He stated his opinion as an expert. Now, everyone around him was allowed to do that.
Yeah.
Why was he not allowed as a former general? So when does the double standard become something that not just is it an unequal relationship when the soldiers are in uniform, but become a double standard that when they prepare to build that next life, that they're still held to an unrealistically high standard that the politicians rarely meet?
Drilling down a little bit further though, being a member of any bureaucracy demands that all members of the team subscribe to the same worldview. It is how careers are built essentially. Outliers and rebels who hold differing opinions from the majority are usually treated poorly. Is there a way in which minority opinion, however divergent from the norm, can be legitimately raised and seriously considered, even when bandwagoning effects have largely determined what a group's policy outcome will be? Now, you talk about a safe space. Can you say more about how you can create a safe space in a bureaucracy that up to now has not necessarily got that safe space, that when people do put their necks on the line, and they may be doing it for all the noble reasons, they usually get their head lopped off one way or the other?
I would argue that we'll use the evidence of who the military are talking to and engaging with in the US to make this point. We'll go, okay, if it's a hierarchy that can't deal with difference and openness, why is it getting positive psychologists like Martin Seligman and Sean Aker and the lady who wrote Grit, Angela Duckworth, in? Why is it getting psychologists like Marilee Adams in to talk about the difference between asking learner questions and judger questions? It seems very clear that certainly within the world of uniform, there is a desire to make it possible that when they take something up to the political masters, it at some level has been tested in as open and thorough a way as possible. That there are times where discussion is possible, but once the boss makes a decision, that's that.
Yep.
So that's not saying that military hierarchy doesn't work or that it's overbearing. It's saying that discussion is one thing, but then the boss makes a decision.
Yeah.
Then the boss presents that to the political masters. Then the political masters take a decision. This is constantly a thing of the fine line between the discussion space and the decision has been made. And there's plenty of evidence in the US in particular that they're trying very hard to make sure that this discussion space is present and that people are equipped to use it. So if we look back to after 9/11, it appears that President Bush really let people like Petraeus get on with winning. He hadn't defined winning, so soldiers did. So when someone like President Obama said to Stan McChrystal and David Petraeus, win in Afghanistan, well, they went off and kept trying to win their way. And then he goes, no, I don't like that. And, they made a big deal in some of the books about his first term in office, of how he sat down and wrote 5 pages of what winning in Afghanistan meant to him. And this was like, it's ridiculous that the soldiers had to have this written out for them. Well, is it ridiculous? They went from understanding winning in terms of tactical victories leading to a strategic victory. Now they were given what the political definition was, and the minute they were given it, they changed strategy.
Yeah.
So once again, we go back to the point that each professional is trained in their area. And the political professional has to be as clear about how they are going to exercise control as the soldier in how they're going to apply their expertise in the management and application of violence. That if both of them or either of them fail, we end up with the messes of the last 10 years.
Yeah. Okay, well, returning to General Mattis, considering that, his fall from grace was that he aired his concerns about the Iranians at a time when Obama was preparing his rapprochement with Tehran, a rapprochement that has largely failed to restrain Iranian actions in the Middle East in spite of the nuclear deal, would a President Trump be more open to accepting the advice of a rebellious Marine Corps general?
I'll start with the end point, and that is, he's not rebellious.
Well, according to Obama, he may have been.
Yeah, but
rebellious.
Obama had to deal with Petraeus, who scared the hell out of him, and Stan McChrystal, who was willing to keep, sending JSOC in to kick indoors at 3 a.m. Obama did not deal with the reality of uniform deciding what victory looks like and getting on with it. How was Obama ever going to deal with a hard-charging Marine general? But let's put this hard-charging Marine general in context. This is a hard-charging Marine general that came up through the ranks in General Krulak's reformed Marine Corps. The Marine Corps that absorbed the 3-block war. The Marine Corps that absorbed the idea of think first. It's Mattis who launched the Combat Hunter program that allowed platoons of Marines to spot the person acting weird in a crowd, isolate them, and quite often arrest them rather than kill them.
Yep.
Mattis is a highly evolved general. So by political standards, he may rattle them because he looks more charismatic, more forthright, better informed, and more credible.
And his nickname is Mad Dog.
Yeah. But again, it's the Marine Corps.
Yeah.
You're hardly going to call him pleasant thinker.
Nice guy.
Yeah, we're not going to have
nice guy with an M16.
we're not going to have pleasant thinker Mattis.
No,
We're going to have Mad Dog Mattis. But let's look at Trump. One thing that is clear is he surrounds himself with people with lots of information, and that he supposedly listens and then does what he damn well pleases.
That's true. That's what the reputation is so far.
So would it matter who you stuck around him?
That's leading me to the next question, Dave. So let's go one step further. Was Mattis's appointment a wise move? And could we even go one step further still and argue that his appointment was part of Trump's overall strategy of draining the swamp that is Washington, D.C. and shaking the system up?
He's a Marine Corps general who genuinely seemed to do things to benefit the Marine Corps. He's not politicised in the way that Petraeus was. It seems to me a pretty sensible pick. He's not a Special Forces general who's going to go cloak and dagger, let JSOC off the leash with 70,000 motivated people and wreak havoc across the planet.
Yeah.
So if the toss-up were Petraeus, who is a political animal, Stan McChrystal, who could have turned it back into JSOC, or Mattis, really?
Mattis was a good move.
It seems a very credible choice from the branch of the military who, in a sense, because they're an integrated force, brings the most understanding of integrated operations, broad spectrum operations to the table that anyone could bring in a single voice.
All right, here's another thing for you. Mattis would be of the type that would understand the nature and dynamics of alliance relationships. Now, here in Australia, since Trump has become president-elect of the United States, we've been running around like headless chickens trying to figure out whether this is a good thing, a bad thing, or something in between. I suppose one could then say that having Mattis as Secretary of Defence and being someone who understands these issues of war and peace and alliance and what's good and what's bad in terms of alliance, Australia's position in the alliance framework with the United States is pretty much secure with someone like Mattis in charge of the defence apparatus in the United States. Would I be correct?
I suppose what it would do would make people in uniform in Australia go, the close relationship might be okay if this is the mediating force between Trump's tantrums and practical outcomes.
Yeah.
That there is a sensible, highly experienced person in the middle. And that really we can all guesstimate what happens next year. But until Trump gets power and starts exercising on a daily basis, we've got a reasonable person with a heap of experience. In Mattis, that's a step forward. That gives us one less reason to worry. Has it got rid of the problem of what Trump does next? No. Is the phone call to Taiwan somewhat worrying for most insiders? Yes.
Yeah.
Is it an interesting tactic to see how far you can push China and how they respond? Absolutely. Have insiders dealt with that, reading on it well? No. So the fact that Mattis took a hard line on Iran, when in reality they were going, we got a deal, now let's push you. That's the line that's been used on Americans, it seems, or on America for the last 15 years by nearly everyone. You say what you're going to do, but we'll push you anyway. And America has not used power well, has not used its influence well. So someone who actually states that reality, truth in the halls of diplomacy and international relations, rather than idealistic cosmopolitanism, does seem somehow to be a step forward.
Yeah, I agree with you. But interestingly enough, in terms of Mattis being the choice for the Secretary of Defence, it leads me to the next obvious question, and that is, what would be a good fit in the Secretary of State category? Who is going to be America's key diplomat? I mean, if we already have someone that is known by the name of Mad Dog, who gets the job done, who's the kind of go-to guy if you're in a knife fight, who will be the best diplomat? Could it be David Petraeus? I know his name has been bandied around. Or would it be better to have someone like a Mitt Romney, someone who, talks in the language of the old elite, so there's some sort of continuity feeding back to what the swamp used to be looking like, and not necessarily freaking too many people out. But then if, a Romney-type figure can't get the job done, you wheel out Mattis to scare the living crap out of people.
I think I'm going to stay with your swamp analogy.
Okay. What, the draining of the swamp?
No. I would argue that, Romney is a creature of the swamp.
Yeah.
He's happily swimming around 2 eyeballs, 2 nostrils above the water.
What does that make Petraeus then? If he is a serious contender?
This was what I was about to say. Is Petraeus is the creature in the swamp that Romney's looking out for.
So he's like the creature in the Black Lagoon.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Romney's the 5-foot alligator going, I'm kind of scary.
Yeah.
Petraeus is whatever eats alligators.
Yeah, okay.
So I would argue in picking Romney, he would get essentially, a hack. A hack like the rest of a potential conventional Republican cabinet. What's the point? He won on a protest vote. Don't pick a sort of, an insider candidate. And yet, if he goes Petraeus, he's going to a highly politically capable, venal creature. And I'll use that word because, again, lots of people were talking that Petraeus was a potential candidate for president.
Yes, that's right.
If he got this gig now, is it a way for him to put his reputation back together? And, Trump is not an old man, but an older man. It's unlikely to be 8 years. Would Petraeus be a logical successor in as much as, how did he go off the reservation? He did the dastardly with his biographer.
Yep.
In the scheme of things, that's not giving secrets to the Chinese. It's not snorting cocaine off his big toe. His going off the reservation, it was unpleasant in a pretendy, hyper-moral way. They live life just like everyone else, so when something happens, they make more of a tantrum about it because they hold themselves to an impossible standard.
Sure.
So if the worst thing he did was have sex with his biographer, really, by standards of Italian politics...
Oh, well...
Where's the problem?
Let's not talk about Silvio.
So my point being is, I think in a sense, Romney would be not far enough one way. He's too much still the conventional candidate. And perhaps Petraeus is...
More of a threat.
Yeah. So, is there a diplomat who genuinely could be the diplomat?
Bob Corker, who served on the Senate House Foreign Affairs Committee. And apparently he's a good operator and probably would be the guy that would fall between the cracks of a Romney or a Petraeus. So if you were a Trump that thought, well, look, I'd like to, hang on to this gig for as long as I possibly can. I don't want to necessarily have someone breathing over my shoulder, looking to replace me. And yet I also don't want to have someone who will tarnish me as being part of the establishment that I'm riling against. Then Corker would probably be the guy that he would choose.
So let's argue that is the compromise because it gets the job done without opening doors. If Trump wants to upset the system and wants a legacy, would he then still want to find some sort of role for Petraeus? Because let's be blunt, massive amounts of charisma, high public profile, an ego on a par with Trump's, a heck of a record until he slipped. Do you really not want to make use of a contender who is now like you outside the system, but could carry your dream forward? It seems to me that if Petraeus doesn't get this job, it makes no sense that he wouldn't get some other job because there's just too much talent there not to use. If Trump wants people who aren't Washington but understand power, in a sense, this residual group of generals are a good bunch of people to reach out to. They get stuff done. They've all been on the edge of Washington, seeing how horrible it can be. Some of them, like that Petraeus, manipulated it brilliantly. They all made Obama uncomfortable, which is a sad indictment of the Democratic Party and their inability to run communication strategy well enough to beat a general in his media office. So it's a very interesting question. You'd want Petraeus around for something. Again, there's still talk of Mike Flynn getting some sort of role, despite the fact he appears to really have been very badly affected by something between Afghanistan and now. For sort of blurts about racism and Islam that just seem totally uncharacteristic to the very measured way he was a senior general.
It was probably the role that he had that traumatized him so deeply and allowed him to vent in a very inappropriate way, which may probably come back and haunt him and not give him any position whatsoever because he's probably going to be politically cactus.
And if that's the case with Flynn, it makes Petraeus in a role seem even more likely. Because again, the only thing Petraeus got himself in trouble for was a sex drive.
Well, you can't really, hold him against...
Most societies wouldn't.
No. Well,
only a pretendy prudish one like America would.
Yeah. Thanks for listening to this episode. We hope that you'll join us for our next exciting adventure through the world of geopolitics. Remember that you can subscribe to Strategicon through iTunes, SoundCloud and YouTube. And please like us on the Sage International Australia Facebook site and follow us on Twitter. We're always looking to pass on the most interesting information on international relations and security to our social media followers. And until next time, it's goodbye from me, John Bruni.
And farewell from me, David Olney.
Connect with your potential customers wherever they are. Effective uses Comcast viewership data insights to combine advanced targeting capabilities with premium TV and streaming content, so you can deliver the best ad experiences to your audience no matter how they watch. Visit EFFECTV.com.
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.